My name is Captain Rachel Doyle. I was 33 years old when my father stood on his porch, in the middle of a Category 2 storm warning, and told my 8-year-old daughter to get off his property. She was barefoot. She was in a t-shirt with a faded cartoon fox on the front. She weighed 54 pounds, and the wind that night was strong enough to knock branches off the oak tree in the front yard. It took the search team almost 2 hours to find her, huddled behind a gas station dumpster 3 streets away, soaked to the bone, shaking so hard her teeth were cutting the inside of her lip. He did it because of 6 words spoken by an 11-year-old boy. 6 words that nobody in that house bothered to question, because questioning them would have meant admitting who they had really been protecting for the last 14 months. What happened in that emergency room, and what my father said when he saw my uniform still creased from a 16-hour flight, changed the shape of my family forever. But what none of them knew, standing in that hallway under those fluorescent lights, was that I had already spent 2 months building the case that would end their control over my daughter's life for good. Welcome back to the channel. If you're new here, this is where we tell real stories about the moments that test a family to its breaking point, and the quiet, disciplined strength it takes to protect the people who can't protect themselves. If this story reaches you, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Let's get into it. Why I left. I grew up in a house where obedience was the only currency that mattered. My father, Walter Hale, ran his household the way some men run a business, with quarterly expectations and no room for a bad review. My mother, Diane, learned early in their marriage that agreeing with him was easier than surviving the alternative, so she agreed with him about everything, including things she didn't actually believe. I have one sister, Megan, 3 years older than me. Megan understood the family's rules instinctively in a way I never could. She dated the boy my father approved of. She stayed in our hometown. She got married at 22 in the church my parents attended every Sunday, and when she had her son a year later, my father cried at the hospital like he'd been handed a trophy. I was the daughter who asked too many questions. Why does Dad get to decide who I marry? Why does Mom apologize for things that aren't her fault? Why is Megan allowed to disagree with him and I'm not? I never got real answers, just the same tired refrain, "You'll understand when you're older, Rachel, this is just how families work." At 18, I enlisted. Not out of some deep patriotic calling, though that came later. I enlisted because it was the only door in my life my father didn't have a key to. He couldn't call my commanding officer and tell them how to raise me. He couldn't show up at basic training and lecture me about respect. For the first time in my life, the rules were written down somewhere other than in his head, and they applied to everyone the same way. He never said he was proud of me. Not once, not at graduation, not when I made captain years later, not when I deployed the first time. What he said, every single time I called home, was some version of the same question: when are you going to stop playing soldier and come live like a normal person? I built a career instead. Logistics and supply chain management, the unglamorous backbone that keeps an army moving. By 26, I was managing distribution for an entire brigade. I was good at my job because I was good at seeing patterns other people missed, small discrepancies in a spreadsheet that pointed to a much bigger problem 3 steps down the line. It's a skill that would matter more than I ever expected, just not in the way the Army trained me for. Becoming Emma's mother. I met Danny during a training rotation. He was a contractor working logistics support, funny in the particular way that made 12-hour shifts bearable, and gone within 4 months of finding out I was pregnant. No fight, no dramatic scene, just a slow disappearing act that ended with an unanswered phone number and a box of his things I eventually donated because I didn't want them taking up space in Emma's nursery. I had Emma alone. I labored alone in a military hospital with a nurse holding my hand because my mother said the drive was too far and my father didn't offer to make it. I raised her in base housing, learned to read a deployment schedule the way other mothers read a school calendar, and became fluent in the particular loneliness of doing everything important by yourself. None of that made me bitter about her. If anything, it made me fiercer. Emma was the first person in my life who looked at me like I was already enough, no improvements required. When she asked me where we were going next, I always told her the truth. Wherever the army sends us, baby, and we'll figure it out together. And we always did. What I wasn't prepared for, what nobody prepares you for, is how much you can miss while you're doing your job on the other side of the world. I was excellent at logistics. I understood how supply chains function, how small failures compound, how you have to inspect the parts of a system you can't personally see or the whole thing quietly falls apart. I applied none of that instinct to my own family until it was almost too late. The deployment no one could refuse. When my orders came through for an 8-month rotation to a forward logistics hub overseas, I had 96 hours to finalize a family care plan. Every parent in uniform knows this document. It isn't optional. You name a caregiver, you notarize it, you hand your child to someone you trust with the most important thing in your life, and then you get on a plane. My first instinct was Danny's sister, a woman Emma adored, but she'd just had her second child and was drowning enough without adding a school-age kid to the mix. My second option was a fellow officer's wife, someone kind but essentially a stranger to Emma. My third option, the one that arrived before I even asked, was my parents. My mother called the night I got my orders. Of course she can stay with us, Rachel. We have the room. She's family. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest, a knot I hadn't realized was there. My parents had a house with a yard, a highly rated school district, and 2 people who had successfully raised 2 children of their own. On paper, it was the safest, most stable option available to me. What I didn't fully account for was my nephew Colton, Megan's son, who was 11 at the time and had spent most of his life essentially living at my parents' house whenever Megan and her husband needed a break. He had a room there with his own bed, his own shelf of trophies, a nightlight in the shape of a football that had been on since he was 4. He wasn't a guest in that house. He was a fixture. I signed the family care plan naming Walter and Diane Hale as Emma's temporary legal guardians. I set up an automatic monthly transfer for groceries, school supplies, anything she'd need. My father never once mentioned that money to me, and I found out much later that he never mentioned it to Megan either, as if the fact that I was paying my own way somehow needed to stay hidden. The night before I deployed, I sat on the edge of Emma's bed in our base apartment, packing the last of her things into a duffel bag that would stay with her at my parents' house. I pulled a small laminated card from my jacket pocket, her military dependent ID, her photo on the front, my rank and name printed below it, an emergency contact number on the back. I clipped it inside the front pocket of her backpack, the one she'd use for school. "What's that for, Mommy?" she asked. I told her it meant that no matter where in the world I was, if she ever needed help and showed that card to the right person, they would find a way to reach me. "Even if you're really far away?" she asked. "Even then," I said. "That will never change." She was quiet for a second, picking at a loose thread on her blanket, and then she said something I filed away and told myself I'd revisit later. "What if Grandpa gets loud again?" I asked her what she meant by again, and she just shrugged, the particular shrug of an 8-year-old who understands something is wrong but doesn't yet have the words to explain it. "He just gets loud sometimes when Colton breaks something," she said. "He thinks it was me." I should have pulled that thread right there. I should have called my mother that same night and asked pointed, specific questions instead of filing it under normal grandfather sternness. Instead I told myself he was strict, not dangerous, and that a house with 2 responsible adults was safer than any other option on the table. I was right about one of those things. I would spend the next 8 months slowly discovering which one. The first silences. Overseas, my days ran long and my nights ran short, and I scheduled video calls for whatever hour lined up with Emma's lunch break back home. Those calls were supposed to happen at her school on a tablet the counselor's office kept for exactly this purpose. Instead, my mother insisted on hosting them from the kitchen, citing better internet, though the real reason became obvious within a few weeks. My mother was always in frame. Adjusting the camera, hovering just behind Emma's shoulder, smiling in a way that felt more like supervision than warmth. "How was school, baby?" "Fine. What did you do today?" Nothing much. Are you and Colton getting along? A long pause before a small, careful yes. This was a child who used to talk for 20 straight minutes about a beetle she found on the playground or a joke her teacher told. Now I was getting single words and a gaze that kept drifting somewhere off camera, like she was checking whether it was safe to say more. I asked my mother directly if something was going on. She waved it off. She's adjusting, Rachel. All kids do this when their routine changes. Give it time. I asked if I could talk to Emma alone for once, without anyone standing behind her. My mother told me the Wi-Fi signal was weakest in the other rooms. I let it go. That's the sentence that still keeps me up some nights. I let it go, because I trusted the people I'd trusted my whole childhood to at least tell me the truth about my own daughter. The drawing. A care package arrived for me about 6 weeks in. Inside were a few of Emma's favorite snacks, a school photo, and a folded piece of construction paper. I unfolded it expecting a rainbow or a house with a sun in the corner. What I found instead was a family portrait, in the sense that 8-year-olds draw family portraits, and it told me more than any phone call had. On the left side of the page, in bright, confident crayon, stood a tall man, a woman with curled hair, and a smaller woman holding hands with a boy. All 4 figures were smiling, clustered close together. On the far right side of the page, separate from the group, stood one small figure with no smile and nobody touching her. Underneath, in careful handwriting, she'd written the words "my family." I called home immediately. My father answered, irritated at being pulled away from his evening. I told him about the drawing, about the way she'd drawn herself standing alone. He grunted and told me kids draw nonsense, that I shouldn't read into a piece of construction paper, and then, almost as an afterthought, added that maybe if I were actually present instead of playing soldier overseas, my daughter wouldn't be drawing sad pictures in the first place. Then he hung up. I kept a small notebook in my footlocker after that, the kind with an elastic band around the cover. I wrote the date, what he'd said, and what the drawing showed. I folded the drawing itself and kept it in my uniform's breast pocket for the rest of the deployment, close enough that I could feel it there during long shifts, a reminder that something back home needed my attention in a way I hadn't yet figured out how to give it. The paper trail. I started paying closer attention to every piece of information I could access from thousands of miles away. Emma's school had an online portal for parents, and I checked it most mornings before my shift started. Attendance logs. Pickup records. Teacher notes. What I found was a pattern that repeated with mechanical consistency. Colton was picked up every day at 3:15 sharp by my father, straight into the car line, home in time for snacks and television. Emma was enrolled in the after-school program, picked up around 5:30, sometimes closer to 6, by my mother. The emergency contact listed on Emma's file wasn't even my father's name. He hadn't bothered to put it there. I called the school directly and spoke with a receptionist who told me, gently, that Emma was doing fine academically but was noticeably quiet, quieter than most of her classmates. I asked who picked her up most days. She confirmed it was almost always my mother, and almost always later than the other kids' families. Colton left at 3:15. Emma waited nearly 2 extra hours, most days, in an after-school room designed for kids whose parents worked late shifts, not for a child whose grandparents simply preferred not to make the trip twice. I noticed the same asymmetry everywhere I looked once I started looking. Colton's birthday that October had 15 kids, a rented bounce house, and a cake shaped like a football field, all documented across Megan's social media in bright, celebratory photos. Emma's birthday in January arrived as a single text message from my mother, a photo of Emma at the kitchen table with a store-bought sheet cake, no candles lit, no friends in the frame, just my mother standing behind her holding a paper plate. When I asked my mother why the 2 birthdays looked so different, she told me they'd already spent a lot that month and that Emma hadn't wanted anything big anyway. I pointed out that Emma was 8, and 8-year-olds want parties. My mother's response was the sentence that has stayed lodged in my chest ever since. Colton lives here full-time, Rachel. Emma's situation is temporary. She used the word temporary the way you'd describe a rental car, and I understood in that moment that in my parents' house, my daughter was a guest, and Colton was the grandchild who actually counted. Making the call. I sat down at a communications terminal on base at 3 a.m. and typed a hardship reassignment request. 2 pages, single-spaced, nothing but facts. Military regulation allows for early return when the conditions of an approved family care plan materially change, and I cited every documented concern, the pickup discrepancies, the birthday disparity, the drawing, my father's comments about my parenting. I attached the school's contact information and a scanned copy of Emma's construction paper family portrait. My commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Marsh, called me into his office the next day and asked me one direct question. "Doyle, is your daughter safe?" I told him honestly that I didn't know, and that was exactly the problem. He signed the request that same afternoon and pushed it up the chain without hesitation. I also called an old friend from a previous posting, now serving as a JAG officer, Captain Elena Reyes. I asked her, off the record at first, what my options were if I suspected favoritism or neglect from a designated caregiver. Her answer was immediate and practical. Document everything. Screenshots, dates, direct quotes. If this ever becomes a legal matter, you want a paper trail that starts well before any incident, not one that's assembled in a panic afterward. For the next 2 months, that's exactly what I did. I logged every phone call. I saved every text message from my mother into a folder labeled simply, family. I scanned every drawing Emma sent me. I told no one in my family that I had requested an early return or that I was quietly building a case. 2 months of paperwork, 2 months of waiting for approval to come through, and then, 3 weeks before my reassignment was finalized, Colton told a lie that changed the timeline for all of us. The pattern no one questioned. Colton had been lying about Emma for months before that final incident, and I only pieced together the full extent of it much later, through school records, a counselor's notes, and eventually a forensic interview. The first lie was small and almost forgettable on its own. A television remote thrown against the wall during a tantrum over a video game. When my father stormed in to see what broke, Colton pointed at Emma. She said she hadn't touched it. My father told her to stop making excuses and sent her to her room. The second lie involved a batch of cookies my mother had baked for a class party. Half the tray vanished overnight, and Colton told my mother that Emma had eaten them after dinner. In reality, Colton had given the cookies to a friend from down the street. My mother never asked Emma her side of the story. She simply told her she needed to learn some self-control. The third lie escalated further. Colton told his teacher that Emma had called him a name during recess. The school separated the two of them for a week while the incident was reviewed, and no other student could corroborate his account. By the time the school determined there was no evidence to support the claim, the separation had already happened, and Emma spent that entire week eating lunch by herself. The pattern was identical every time. Colton spoke, the adults believed him instantly, Emma denied it, and the adults dismissed her denial without a second thought. My mother told Emma at one point, in front of the whole family, that nobody likes a child who makes up stories to get attention. After that, Emma mostly stopped telling anyone anything at all. She started drawing instead, and it was through those drawings, and through one particular adult who actually paid attention to them, that I learned how bad things had really gotten. The counselor's call. The school counselor, a woman named Mrs. Alvarez, had been meeting with Emma once a week since the previous November. Emma trusted her because Mrs. Alvarez never interrupted her while she drew, she simply sat with her and waited. She called me on a Saturday morning while I was eating in the mess hall overseas, my personal phone lighting up with a number I didn't recognize. She introduced herself and told me she'd been noticing patterns worth flagging. Emma had grown increasingly withdrawn since the start of the school year. She no longer played with other kids at recess. She sat alone in the cafeteria corner and drew instead of eating with anyone. She flinched, visibly, whenever an adult raised their voice nearby, even when the raised voice had nothing to do with her. Then Mrs. Alvarez told me something that made my hand tighten around the phone until my knuckles went white. She told me Emma had said her grandfather told her she wasn't a real Hale. That real Hales don't lie and don't cause trouble, and that Emma apparently didn't fit that description in his eyes. I closed my eyes and let that sentence sit in my chest for a long moment, because I recognized it instantly. My father had said something almost identical to me the day I told him I was enlisting. Real Hales stay close to family, you're walking away from everything that matters. Now he was saying it to an 8-year-old. Mrs. Alvarez told me she wasn't required to file a formal report yet, but she wanted me aware of the pattern she was documenting. I thanked her, asked her to email me her session notes, and hung up. I sat outside in the heat for a long time afterward, added 3 more lines to my green notebook, and understood, fully and finally, that my father hadn't changed in the slightest since I was a child. He'd simply found a new child to say those words to. My sister's suggestion. I called Megan the next day, telling myself it would be a simple conversation between 2 mothers who both wanted what was best for their kids. It lasted less than 5 minutes. I asked her directly whether Emma seemed okay at our parents' house. Her answer was a sigh loud enough to make sure I heard it, followed by the words, "She's fine, Rachel, she just needs to learn her place." I asked what exactly that meant. Megan explained, without a trace of hesitation, that Colton had lived there longer, that he knew the household rules, that he helped my father in the garage and set the table without being asked, while Emma apparently just sat in her room and drew. I pointed out, as calmly as I could manage, that Emma was 8 years old, that Colton had 2 parents and his own bedroom, and that Emma was sleeping on a pull-out couch in a guest room with no curtains. There was a pause, and then Megan said the sentence I was not prepared for. She told me she'd mentioned to our parents that maybe they should just look into adopting Emma, since I was never around anyway and Emma needed real stability. She said it the way you'd suggest returning a piece of furniture that didn't fit the room. I hung up without responding, opened my laptop, and started drafting formal notes for what I now understood would need to be a custody review, not just a hardship reassignment. My own sister had floated the idea of my parents adopting my daughter, out loud, as though it were a reasonable solution rather than an attack on the only parent Emma had ever had. That night I decided that when I finally came home, I would come home prepared, not with anger, but with documentation thick enough that no one in that family could talk their way around it. Coming home quietly. 3 weeks later my reassignment came through. Lieutenant Colonel Marsh handed me the paperwork himself, told me whatever was happening back home needed to be handled, that logistics could survive without me for a while but my daughter apparently couldn't wait. I packed my footlocker in under an hour, the green notebook, my laptop, Emma's drawing still folded in my breast pocket. The flight home took the better part of a full day, layovers and turbulence stacked one after another. I landed, rented a car, and drove straight to a hotel 12 minutes from my parents' house. I did not call them. I did not drive past their street. Instead I called Captain Reyes and asked what came next. She told me the family care plan revocation paperwork was already drafted and ready to file first thing Monday morning. Once filed, my parents would immediately lose their designated caregiver status and legal guardianship would revert to me. If they refused to cooperate, we'd escalate to family court. She told me not to tell anyone I was back in the country, to go to the school first, to build my case in daylight before confronting anyone directly. If you confront them now, she warned me, they will play the victim, and you will lose the advantage of surprise. I understood, intellectually, that she was right. Emotionally, sitting alone in a hotel room 12 minutes from where my daughter was sleeping, it was one of the hardest instructions I've ever followed in my life. Watching from the car. The next morning I drove to Emma's school and met with Mrs. Alvarez in person. She had an entire folder waiting for me, months of drawings arranged by date, each one telling a small piece of a much larger story. September showed Emma and Colton at a table together, both smiling, ordinary and unremarkable. By October, a gap had appeared between Emma's figure and the rest of the family group. By November, she'd drawn herself smaller than everyone else, with no one holding her hand. By December, she'd drawn a large red circle for my father's face, mouth wide open, and a tiny figure at the bottom with blue dots representing tears. The most recent drawing, from just a few weeks earlier, showed only two figures holding hands, one small, with brown hair, and one tall, wearing green. Underneath, in wobbly handwriting, she'd written what I want. Mrs. Alvarez told me quietly that she believed the taller figure was me, in uniform. I photographed every single page, front and back, dates clearly visible, and sent the entire file to Captain Reyes before I even left the parking lot. That afternoon I parked across the street from my parents' house and watched the school buses arrive. Colton came first, and my father met him at the curb, ruffled his hair, carried his backpack inside, left the front door open behind them. 20 minutes later the second bus arrived, and Emma stepped off alone, adjusting her backpack straps on the sidewalk before walking up the driveway to a door that had already been closed. She knocked. My 8-year-old daughter had to knock on the door of the house she'd lived in for over a year. My mother opened it without a greeting, told her to wipe her shoes, and Emma disappeared upstairs within seconds while, through the front window, I could see Colton already settled on the couch with a snack and the television on. I sat in that car with both hands on the steering wheel and made myself breathe slowly, because every instinct in my body wanted to walk across that street immediately. The neighbor's testimony. That evening I called Mrs. Kowalski, my parents' next-door neighbor of nearly 30 years, a woman who had taught me to plant tomatoes when I was small and who brought my mother a pie every holiday without fail. I asked her, gently, whether she'd noticed anything unusual with Emma. She was quiet for a moment before answering, and what she told me confirmed everything I'd already begun to suspect. She said Emma sat alone on the back porch most evenings after dinner while Colton played in the yard with my father. She said she could hear my father's voice through the shared wall between their houses, raised and sharp, more often than she felt comfortable mentioning, and that it had been getting noticeably worse since the winter holidays. I wrote down everything she told me, times, dates, specific phrases, and added it to the growing file I was building for Captain Reyes. Later that night I drove past my parents' house one more time, telling myself I only intended to check on things from a distance. I parked in the driveway longer than I meant to, hand resting on the door handle, listening through the open window as my father's voice carried out into the yard, sharp and controlling, followed by Emma's small, careful response. Every part of me wanted to walk up those steps and carry her out of that house without saying a single word to anyone. Captain Reyes's advice was louder in my head than my own anger. If you confront them now, they will play the victim. I need the system on my side first. I pulled my hand off the door, backed slowly out of the driveway, and drove 4 blocks before I had to pull over just to steady myself enough to keep driving. I called Reyes from the hotel parking lot that night and told her to file the revocation paperwork first thing in the morning, that I wanted it on record no matter what. She promised it would be submitted by 9 a.m. I asked her what I should do if something happened before then. Her answer was simple. Call 911 first, and call me second. I lay awake that whole night, counting down the hours until morning, trusting that nothing would go wrong before the paperwork could be filed. I didn't get those hours. The storm arrived first. The necklace. Here is what happened inside my parents' house that evening, pieced together later from Colton's forensic interview, from Mrs. Kowalski's account, and eventually from my mother's own tearful admission. Around 8:30 that night, my mother went upstairs to retrieve a small antique gold locket she planned to wear to church the next morning, a piece that had belonged to her own grandmother and had been passed down through 3 generations of women in our family. The velvet box on her dresser was empty. She searched the bedroom, then the bathroom, then the hallway closet, growing more frantic with each empty drawer. My father came downstairs to help her search, and it was Colton, sitting quietly in the living room, who offered an explanation nobody bothered to question. "Grandpa, I saw Emma put something in her backpack after school. She was being sneaky about it." My father didn't ask him a single follow-up question. He didn't ask what exactly Colton had seen or when. He walked straight to the guest room, grabbed Emma's backpack off the floor, and unzipped the front pocket. The locket was inside. Colton had taken it from the dresser that afternoon while Emma was upstairs doing homework, walked it into the guest room, and slipped it into her bag himself, then zipped it closed and went back to the television as though nothing had happened. He was 11 years old, and he understood exactly what would happen next. My father's face turned the same shade of red I remembered from the day I told him I was enlisting. He called Emma downstairs. She came in bare feet, in pajamas, with no idea what was waiting for her. "Get out." The storm had been building outside for hours by that point, rain turning sideways, wind gusts strong enough to shake the gutters and knock a branch off the oak tree in the front yard. Inside, my father held up the locket in one hand and Emma's backpack in the other, told her she had stolen it from her grandmother's dresser. She told him, quietly and clearly, that she hadn't taken anything and had no idea how it got there. He threw the backpack onto the floor and told her he'd had enough of her lying and sneaking around. My mother stood behind him, clutching the locket to her chest, saying absolutely nothing in Emma's defense. Megan arrived 10 minutes later, having been called by my parents, and immediately crossed her arms and announced that this was exactly what happened when a child had no structure in her life. Colton stood in the doorway, silent, picking at his fingernails, watching the consequences of his own lie unfold in real time. My father leaned down over Emma and asked if she had anything to say for herself. She told him again that she hadn't done it. He told her that Colton had seen her, and that Colton doesn't lie, said with the same flat, unquestionable certainty as a man reciting scripture. Thunder cracked outside hard enough to rattle the kitchen window. Emma pressed her back against the stair railing, pulled her knees to her chest, and went very, very still, the specific stillness that children learn once they realize the adults around them have become unpredictable. Then my father said the words that would put my daughter in an emergency room. 2 years of your lying, he told her. 2 years of your attitude and now stealing on top of it. He grabbed her backpack off the floor and shoved it into her lap, told her that if she wanted to act like she didn't belong in that house, he'd oblige her. He walked to the front door, and the sound of the storm filled the hallway the second he turned the handle. He didn't close it gently behind himself. "Get out," he said. "I don't need a lying granddaughter." Emma stood up without arguing, without screaming, slipped her arms through her backpack straps, and walked out into a storm that had already knocked out power to 2 streets over. She was wearing pajama pants covered in small stars and a long-sleeved shirt that said Future Scientist across the front. No shoes. No jacket. No phone. My father closed the door behind her before she'd even reached the bottom porch step. The storm drain. Mrs. Kowalski was rinsing a dinner plate when she heard the door slam hard enough to rattle her own kitchen window. She looked out and saw a small figure walking alone down the sidewalk in the rain, in pajamas, bare feet slapping against wet concrete. She called 911 immediately, telling the dispatcher a child had just been sent out of the house next door into the middle of a severe storm. Inside the house, my mother reportedly sat down at the kitchen table holding the locket and said she thought maybe they should let Emma back in before she caught a cold. My father told her Emma would come back when she was ready to apologize. Megan put on her coat, said she needed to beat the weather home, and gathered Colton to leave. Nobody went to check the porch. Nobody looked out the front window to see where Emma had gone. My daughter walked nearly 4 blocks alone in that storm before she found a drainage culvert wide enough to crawl inside. She sat there hugging her knees, backpack pulled over her head like a shield, until a patrol officer's flashlight caught the reflective strip on her bag. He'd driven the route 3 times before spotting it. She was shaking too hard to speak by the time he reached her, her bare feet cut open from running on wet asphalt, her lips already tinged blue from the cold. Paramedics arrived within minutes and transported her to the county hospital. She was suffering from mild hypothermia, scrapes across both knees and the soles of her feet, dehydration, and an elevated heart rate. Not critical, the intake nurse would later tell me, but nowhere close to okay. When that same nurse checked Emma's backpack for identification, she found the small laminated card I'd clipped there myself the night before I deployed, and dialed the emergency contact number printed on the back. The phone call. I was lying on a hotel bed 12 minutes away, staring at the ceiling and counting down the hours until Captain Reyes could file the revocation paperwork, when my phone rang with a local number I didn't recognize. A nurse from the county hospital told me my daughter had been brought in by police roughly 20 minutes earlier. I don't remember getting into the car. I remember being on the road before she'd finished her sentence. I drove 11 minutes through the storm, parked crooked in the emergency lot, and ran through the sliding doors still in the clothes I'd been wearing since the flight. A nurse pointed me down the hallway to a room where Emma lay in a hospital bed, and 4 taped into her small arm, her hair still damp against the pillow, monitors beeping steadily beside her. I sat down and took her hand and told her I was there and I wasn't leaving. Her eyes opened slowly, and when she saw me, she said one word, "Mommy," in a voice so small it barely reached past the pillow. I told her I was right there, that she was safe now. In her other hand, crumpled against her palm, was a small drawing, 2 stick figures, one small, one in green, holding hands. About 20 minutes later, a hospital social worker introduced herself, explained that she was legally required to file a report with Child Protective Services given that an 8-year-old had arrived with exposure injuries and no legal guardian present at the time of the incident. I told her exactly who I was, that I was Emma's mother, currently stationed with the Army, and that Walter and Diane Hale were her designated caregivers under an official family care plan. I told her I had extensive documentation of concerns leading up to that night, counselor notes, school records, witness statements, and that I would provide every piece of it. She thanked me, told me CPS would open a formal investigation within 24 hours, and left to begin her report. I hadn't made a single accusation. I had simply answered her questions honestly, and the system had begun moving entirely on its own. My father in the doorway. Just over an hour after I arrived, the door to Emma's room opened again, and my father walked in. He saw Emma first, small in that hospital bed, and 4 line running to her arm, and the color drained from his face immediately. Then he turned and saw me sitting beside her in my uniform jacket, my name stitched over the pocket, and his hands started shaking, both of them, fingers trembling against his thighs like he was trying to hold on to something that kept slipping away. He asked how I was even there, told me I was supposed to be overseas. I told him I'd come back early. He tried to explain, said something about Emma stealing her grandmother's necklace, and I told him, calmly and clearly, that we were not going to have that conversation inside a hospital room. My mother arrived behind him, saw Emma, and immediately began crying, saying that none of this would have happened if I'd been there. I looked her directly in the eyes and told her I had trusted her to be there in my place, and that had been my only mistake, one I did not intend to repeat. My father's face shifted from pale to red within seconds when I mentioned that CPS had already been contacted. He asked whether I had called them myself, and I told him the hospital had, because that is exactly what happens when an 8-year-old ends up in an emergency room during a severe storm with no guardian present. A nurse asked us all to lower our voices. My parents left without another word, my mother's crying trailing down the hallway long after the elevator doors had closed behind them. What she told me at midnight. The hospital quieted down after midnight, fluorescent lights dimmed to a low hum, a distant monitor beeping somewhere down the hall in a slow, patient rhythm. I pulled my chair closer to Emma's bed and rested my arms on the railing, and she woke around 1 in the morning, looking at me like she wasn't entirely sure I was real. She asked if she was in trouble, and I told her she was never in trouble for telling the truth. After a long silence, she told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she'd actually seen Colton go into the guest room that afternoon while she was upstairs on the staircase, that she'd watched him do it, but that she hadn't said anything because her grandfather never listened when it came to anything involving Colton. I told her I understood, and that I was going to make sure the right people listened this time. She closed her eyes again, her breathing slowing, her grip on my hand loosening but never fully letting go. I sat in the dark for a long while after that, listening to the machines, watching the slow drip of her 4-line, and then opened my laptop and sent Captain Ray as a complete evidence package, the counselor's notes, the scanned drawings, Mrs. Kowalski's statement, the hospital intake form, every screenshot and log entry from the last 8 months. I had spent nearly 2 years trusting the wrong people with the most important part of my life. Sitting in that chair that night, I finally started trusting the ones who deserved it. The investigation. An investigator named Ms. Whitfield arrived at my parents' house Monday morning, 14 years into her career with CPS, thorough and unshakably calm. She interviewed my parents separately, as protocol required, and immediately noted a discrepancy between their two accounts. My father claimed he'd told Emma to sit on the porch and think about what she'd done. My mother claimed Emma had simply gone outside for air. One version was an order. The other was a choice. Both could not be true. She interviewed Mrs. Kowalski next, who had her own careful notes going back months, times, and dates and exactly what she'd overheard through the shared wall. Mrs. Kowalski repeated my father's exact words from that night, "Get out, I don't need a lying granddaughter," and confirmed she'd called 911 within 30 seconds of hearing the door slam. Ms. Whitfield wrote that quote down in block letters and underlined it, and it went into the official file not as hearsay but as a direct account from a longtime neighbor with no reason whatsoever to lie. Colton's forensic interview took place with a trained child specialist while Megan sat in the room per protocol, instructed not to interrupt. Within a few short questions, Colton's story began shifting between 3 different locations in the house, each version slightly less consistent than the last. When gently reassured that telling the truth wouldn't get him in trouble, he finally admitted, in a whisper, that he'd been the one to put the necklace in Emma's bag, and that his mother had told him Emma needed to learn her place, and that if she got in trouble, Grandpa would send her away for good. Megan's own interview grew tense the moment Ms. Whitfield brought up that statement directly. Megan called it ridiculous, insisted her son was confused, and was met with a simple, unflinching response: "I believed a child's account when it put an 8-year-old in a hospital, so yes, I take children's statements seriously." Megan left the room without another word. The meeting. The formal meeting took place at the county CPS office days later, around a long rectangular table under fluorescent lights, a recording device set in the middle. My parents sat with a lawyer between them. I sat across from them with Captain Reyes beside me and a folder of documentation thick enough to require both hands to carry. Megan did not attend. Ms. Whitfield laid out her findings plainly: the inconsistent statements from my parents, Colton's admission, Mrs. Kowalski's witness account, 6 months of counselor documentation, and the hospital records confirming Emma's injuries. My father tried twice to interrupt, calling it a family matter being blown out of proportion, and was reminded firmly that an 8-year-old hospitalized with hypothermia is, by definition, a child welfare matter, not a family disagreement. My mother cried quietly, insisting they loved Emma, that it had only been one mistake. I looked directly at her and told her that she'd once said none of this would have happened if I'd been there, and that I had trusted her to be there in my place, and that was the only mistake I intended to make twice. Captain Reyes then laid out the paperwork already in motion: the revoked family care plan, the custody review filed with family court, the monthly financial records showing exactly what my parents had been paid for a year of care that had ended in a hospital room. Ms. Whitfield delivered her preliminary findings before the meeting closed. A substantiated report of neglect against both my parents. No unsupervised access to Emma going forward, pending a full review. All future visits to occur at a supervised facility, twice monthly, 2 hours at a time. Guardianship reverted to me immediately, with a formal custody order to follow through family court within 30 days. My father stood, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, told me she was his granddaughter, and I told him that was exactly why this had to happen. My mother reached across the table for my arm, and I gently pulled it back, not out of anger, simply as a boundary I finally understood I was allowed to hold. Our home. I found Emma waiting in the lobby afterward with a young sergeant from Reyes's office, who'd been reading her a picture book to pass the time. She slid off her chair the moment she saw me and ran straight into my arms, asking if we were going home. I told her yes, we were, and she pulled back just far enough to ask, "Our home?" and I told her yes, ours. I could see the edge of her military-dependent ID card still clipped inside her backpack, the same one I'd placed there myself the night before I deployed, the small piece of plastic that ultimately brought her back to me when everyone else in that house had failed to. 3 months later. 3 months later, Emma and I were settled into base housing, a small 2-bedroom apartment with lavender curtains she'd picked out herself and a desk where she drew every evening after dinner, without anyone standing over her shoulder to judge what she put on the page. I'd been reassigned to a stateside logistics position with no deployment scheduled for at least a year, and my commanding officer signed off without a moment's hesitation. Family court finalized full custody in my favor that spring. My parents were granted supervised visitation, 2 hours every other week at a monitored facility, always with a caseworker present. The first visit, my father brought a coloring book and sat quietly across the table from her, unable to say much of anything, and by the end of 2 hours they had managed to color together in silence without him ever mentioning Colton, the necklace, or that night. His hand still shook every time he saw her. Megan hasn't contacted me since that meeting. Colton was enrolled in counseling as part of the CPS requirements, and he eventually sent Emma a short, handwritten apology for the lie about the necklace. I told Emma the choice to respond was entirely hers, and a few days later she wrote back a short, kind note of her own. My mother calls every Sunday evening, brief and careful conversations that mostly stay on the surface, though she keeps asking, gently, if she can come see Emma sooner than the schedule allows. I keep telling her the schedule is set, and we'll see her on Saturday. I used to believe protecting my daughter simply meant keeping a roof over her head and food on her plate and trustworthy-looking adults nearby while I was away doing my job. I understand now that real protection means making absolutely sure the people around her have actually earned the right to be there, and having the discipline to walk away calmly, build the case in silence, and let the truth do the work I was too far away to do myself. That is my story. One storm, one lie, and one mother who came home just in time. If this reminded you that protecting your child is never an overreaction, share it with someone who needs to hear that today. Thank you for watching. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.